lectures on the another episode of the Latin American docuseries. This one is called Pride and Prejudice. And this one chronicles the 1950s, 1960s activity, focusing primarily on Cesar Chavez and Huerta and the different kinds of social movements that are happening across the 60s and early 70s. So I'm going to get into this discussion. Zoot suiters. I gave you a link so that you can look more into it. A zoot suit is a man's suit. It's a high-waisted suit, white, wide-legged, tight cuff trouser. There's a long coat. There's wide lapels with padded shoulders. It becomes a symbol of the Chicano subculture of resistance. It becomes a symbol of Chicano movement. In 1943, there is the Zoot Suit riots. In June of 1943, U.S. sailors marched through downtown Los Angeles carrying clubs and other makeshift weapons and attacking anyone wearing a zoot suit, the baggy pants, oversized coat, because there had been a ban on the use of or the overuse of material because we were in the midst of a recession, and material was one of the things that was affected. So there was more material required to create a zoot suit. So the zoot suit riots took place, and they are attached to that particular period of time. The Bracero program, which is mentioned a couple of times, is a government initiative program from World War II that brought Mexican laborers to replace Americans who were fighting overseas. So, and we'll get into a chapter on immigration so that you can see this kind of push and pull that happens with the United States pretty frequently with immigrant populations, where on the one hand, when we're in need of laborers, we will often campaign in other countries like some Asian countries for the railroads. It was China during this period of World War II. It's in Mexico. There's a period, I believe, we replaced Mexicans with not Puerto Ricans, we replaced Mexicans with Filipinos, I believe is the next group. So there's periods of time where we're calling folks in and asking people to come and be laborers here, and we are deploying a rhetoric about the opportunities that exist in this country. Then usually there's some economic shift that happens here, and then we do a campaigning where you smear the culture and identities of those folks, and then there's a consorted agreement, a concession between citizens of the US to kind of push those people out or to feel like it's acceptable that they be pushed out. Willie Vasquez is a Chicano activist seeking kind of a middle ground between Harry Gonzalez and Jose Angel Gutierrez, who we talked about a couple in the Munez reading. Gonzalez politics was of gradualism, whereas Gutierrez was much more militant in his approach. And Willie Velasquez wanted to kind of position him, seeing that the other two methodologies failed. He wanted to kind of position himself somewhere in the middle of the two, so as to not rock too many boats and still effectively get political power for Latino communities. He actually ends up suing, I want to say it's Texas, and wins 85 voting rights violations. One of the common voting rights violations that happen in this country and still happens in this country is called gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is manipulating or changing the boundaries of a particular locale in order to affect the size and power of the voting district. So you shift the boundaries and borders so that a group of a white community will have more voting power than a brown community will have, even if their populations are disproportionate. Cesar Chavez, I know most of you have heard of Cesar Chavez, is a Mexican-American movement leader in the 1960s. the pretty complicated figure. He was a part of the Mexican American Zoot Suit youth culture. He was also a former Navy soldier. Upon his return from um, being a part of the Navy, he returns to Delano, California, attends a movie and sits in the middle seats, which were reserved for white folks, and gets arrested. But it becomes clear that the arrest is invalid because it is not illegal in California. Segregation had in movie houses had already in law been affected. It just wasn't being practiced. So this effectively desegregates movie houses, right? So remember de facto and de jure, that comes up all the time, de facto and de jure, that there are practices that are legal or are illegal that aren't necessarily made so in reality. Dolores Huerta is a Mexican American organizer who, with Chavez, championed for human rights for some of America's poorest workers. She's a former school teacher from Stockton, California. She is a labor organizer and a leader. She's a co-founder of the United Farm Workers. She was the chief negotiator for the unionization of farm workers. She went on to co-found the National United Farm Workers Organization. She's a really important figure. Some of the movements that were happening to challenge the long history of prejudice and injustice in the United States. One of the biggest movements was the high school walkouts in East Los Angeles. They were also happening in Texas. And then Texas is the site of the founding of the La Raza Unida Party. I want to kind of go over number 5? What hindered efforts to unionize and why? The Bracero program hindered efforts because it brought Mexican laborers in to replace U.S. laborers. On the one hand, we have the McCarran-Walters Act, which is pushing unionizers out and deporting them back to Mexico. On the other hand, we have the Bracero program, which is bringing Mexican immigrants in to replace those who are on the picket line or are attempting to unionize. Mexican laborers could be used against strikers, and if they tried to align themselves with strikers, oftentimes it would end in their deportation. Why was the Inverno Chiquito, the little winter, a dangerous time for unions? It was a dangerous time because there were no workers in the field at the time. So the strike can't be effective if it's not putting pressure on the owners. If they aren't working during that period of time because it's a downtime in the season, then the owners don't need any workers anyway. So the strike is ineffective. In order for a strike to be effective, it has to disrupt business as usual. March 16th of 1966, the Senate Subcommittee on Migratory Labor held hearings in Delano. Robert Kennedy questioned the sheriff and state attorney about practices of arresting peaceful protesters. If you remember in that clip, the sheriff said that they might have, or they were about to commit a crime, or might have committed a crime, and so he was arresting them preemptively, which is illegal. It is after the 16th that Chavez begins his strike the very next day with 100 farm workers, which is off of the schedule. He initially planned on scheduling it later on in the month. What was the fundamental shift in Mexican American identity in the rise of Cesar Chavez as a national leader? We shift from upper class families who tended to be phenotypically more aligned with whiteness, more European looking in their traits as leaders of the community. We get an analysis of the colorism that is encoded in the community and some erosion of that colorism. I'm not arguing that it's gone completely or even significantly, but during this period of time, there's some erosion of that colorism and that kind of classism that was prevalent at the time. Mass deportation is happening during the Great Depression. What were some of the new Chicano movement results? And take note of these. In Chicago, Rodolph Corky Gonzalez organized the first ever Chicano Youth Conference. 1,500 young people rallied to support Chicanos running for office, to demand equal rights for women, and to press for more community involvement in public schools. In Washington, D.C., the National Council of La Raza became the largest Latino organization in the country fighting for civil rights. In New Mexico, Reyes Lopez Tejerina led a movement demanding justice for the descendants of the Mexican Americans whose lands had been taken following the US-Mexican War in 1848. In California, the Farm Workers Union would grow to over 70,000 members, and they gained wages, better working conditions. In San Antonio, Texas, young Chicanos frustrated with the slow pace of social change were challenging the political status quo as represented by Congressman Henry Gonzalez. Jose Angel Gutierrez was the mastermind behind the new wave of student activism and walkouts. He was the son of a local doctor and a graduate student in political science. Gutierrez was a much more militant approach, particularly in reference to Henry Gonzalez. Who are the Texas Rangers? They are an autonomous police force with a history of intimidating and killing Mexicans. The significance of August 29, 1970 is that it was the largest demonstration of Chicano solidarity in the US, with over 30,000 people in the streets of East LA demanding an end to the Vietnam War. It was a peaceful protest. Police responded with excessive, undue military force. 3 people ended up dead in that situation. La Raza Unida is a political party, a political organization. It experienced a lot of success in Texas, specifically in local city councils, in the judicial system, in mayoral elections. It was very, very important. It was a thriving political party for a brief period of time. It is established by Jose Angel Gutierrez. It focused on economic issues, political issues, gaining rights for Chicano people in the political arena. It focused on social issues that were impacting and affecting Chicano and Latin American folks. I did want to point out this one quote by Cesar Chavez. He says, "Every time we sit in the table to have something to eat, the fruit and the vegetables got there because someone was exploited. Every time we eat, somebody had been exploited. They're subjected to the sun and the heat, to the cold and the pesticide poisoning. They're treated like animals. They endure all of these sacrifices and all of this suffering so you and I can eat. These men, women, and children feed all of us and don't have any food for themselves, and we're going to change that." This is the core of he and Huerta's movement, the need to ensure equitable working conditions, equitable pay, equitable quality of life for farm workers. So this is core, or at the center of their mobilization. It's at the center of the organizing for Chicano people. This particular movement, the farm workers movement, and the movement for education for Chicano people, is really, really significant to understanding the Chicano movement writ large. So I'm going to end this one here. You all take care.